Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and we have the privilege today of hearing from Jerry Sittser. Jerry, welcome to the podcast.
My privilege, Adam. Thanks for inviting me.
Jerry is the author of a book recently re-released called A Grace Disguised: How the Soul Grows Through Loss. And I personally have a relationship to this book. I first encountered your book, Jerry, over 20 years ago. And even though your book is explicitly focused on catastrophic loss, which we'll get to in a minute, I did not read it because someone close to me had died. I read it because I was in a lot of emotional pain at the time. I was a young man in my 20s, and I couldn't find any Christian books that seem to address my pain authentically. So your book has been very meaningful to me, and turns out your wife listened to my podcast, reached out to me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is Jerry Sitzer's his remarried new wife, and that's a connection to Jerry, who wrote this book that was so important to me. So that's how we got connected. Why don't you just share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, Jerry? Where are you? What do you spend your time doing?
I live in Spokane, Washington. I've been married to Patricia for 11 years. I'm the father of three biological children, actually four, but one is gone. I'm sure we'll revisit that. And I am the stepfather to two daughters. They're all married. I'm the grandfather of nine, but we have two pregnancies in the family right now. Out of our nine, seven are boys, and seven are 5 and under. So when we get two more grandchildren, it's going to be nine that are 5 and under. So you can imagine what our life is like. I'm a professor emeritus. I taught many years at Whitworth University in the theology department. My specialty is church history, and I write quite a bit too. So I have a very meaningful and rich life.
I stumbled across your book, Jerry, years and years ago while I was really kind of lost. I was in a Christian bookstore browsing the shelves. And after I picked up your book and I read some of the chapter titles, and I immediately bought it. And here are some of the chapter titles that resonated with me as a struggling young man in his 20s. Darkness Closes In, The Silent Scream of Pain, Sailing on a Sea of Nothingness, The Terror of Randomness, and The Absence of God. It's not the only chapters in your book, but it's 5 of them. And these are not the typical chapter titles of most Christian books out there, especially at that time. So, Jerry, why do you think there is such a dearth of honest, authentic Christian literature on the subject of emotional pain and anguish?
That's a really provocative question. Two answers come immediately to mind. The first is that I think we're afraid for God. We're worried that somehow if we ask tougher questions and enter into the darkness of pain and take a good hard look at it, not simply with our brain, but with our body and our emotions, that somehow that's going to damage God's reputation, that God is about the business of just making us happy and fulfilled. And then I think we're also afraid for ourselves, as if pain is somehow an enemy of the spiritual life. But I think it can be enriching to the spiritual life and enlarge our human capacities, especially to reflect the image of God. I'm not sure we need to be afraid for ourselves. In fact, if anything, I think the longer we are avoidant, the worse our life becomes. I think there has to be a kind of courage that we exhibit in deciding to move into pain rather than get over it or run away from it.
My mom died in 2003, and my father was grieving and asked me for help, and I could only recommend 2 books to my grieving father in good conscience. One was Lament for a Son by Nicholas Wolterstorff, which is an excellent book about grief. he lost his 25-year-old son in a mountain climbing accident, and it's his reflections. And the other book I could recommend to my dad was yours, A Grace Disguised. A new edition of it has just been released. But will you tell our listeners, just give them a little bit of an understanding of the tragedy which upended your entire life 30 years ago and would eventually lead to you writing this book?
Well, we had only recently moved to Spokane. Our fourth was born just a few months after arriving here. And my first wife, Linda, was a homeschooler, and she had just finished a unit in Native American culture. So, just 2 years after settling here in Spokane, she decided to schedule a homeschooling field trip. We were invited to attend a powwow in Idaho. Actually, there was a education faculty member at Whitworth who was Native American and wanted to kind of welcome us into that community. So we attended the powwow, actually had dinner with the tribal leaders and discussed, among other things, the curse of alcohol in the tribe and the devastating impact it had on the culture there. And we attended a powwow, and then at about 8:30 left for home, only about 10 minutes outside of the little place where we had visited. I saw a car coming on very fast, and we were on a curve. I actually slowed down a little bit, but the car missed the curve, plowed head on into us. He was going about 85 miles an hour. We were going about 50. He actually cartwheeled over us. I mean, the impact was that direct. And obviously, I mean, I lost my breath and sustained some injuries, but when I kind of came to and surveyed the damage, I realized that it was catastrophic. And as I discovered over the next 15, 20 minutes, I witnessed the death of my daughter, Dinah Jane, who was 4 at the time, and my wife, Linda, and my mother, who was visiting us for the weekend. So 3 generations of women died in an instant. And we were in rural Idaho, so it took quite a long time for emergency vehicles to arrive. And then they were there about an hour. The driver did survive. His wife died. She was thrown from her vehicle, and she was 9 months pregnant. So their unborn child, who was obviously more than viable at that time, also died. So it was a terrible, terrible experience. Interesting, Adam. I've heard from a number of people who were on the scene over the years, emergency vehicle people, nurses. Oh gosh, I mean, some a few years after. Some I just heard from the first person who arrived on the scene 3 months ago, and this tormented her for 30 years. She was only 20 at the time, and I literally handed my 4-year-old daughter who had just died to her because no emergency vehicles had arrived yet. And that sent her on a journey of trauma that lasted for a long time, Adam. She was terrified to contact me because she thought, what has happened to this man and his family? And she finally went on Facebook. And when she called me, she said, "You all look so beautiful to me." And it set off a really meaningful correspondence and conversation. So you get the idea. The rippling effect has continued to this day. Anyway, emergency vehicles finally transported us to a hospital, which was another hour away. And one of my children was severely injured, has since recovered. My other two were injured, but not severely. All is well with them now. They're all in their 30s and well married and parents. And but I'll tell you, Adam, this was a big experience for me, and it was very, very difficult for a long time.
Yeah, catastrophic loss in a millisecond. Your entire, well, like you said, 3 generations of women. You lose your mother, you lose your wife, you lose your daughter.
I think in the category of irreversible losses, it's a difference between, let's say, a broken leg and an amputation. Some losses, though hard, aren't really irreversible losses. You kind of get back to where you were before. I define an irreversible or catastrophic loss, not necessarily as kind of the big explosive event that I experience, but any kind of big loss that draws a line in the sand and you can't get behind it again. So I'd put abuse in that category, or just profound neglect, or severe rejection, or a medical condition that you will never recover from, like lupus, for example, and so on and so forth, where it just it completely changes the categories of your life. And there are many kinds. I mean, mine in some ways was relatively convenient in a way because it was so observable, and it was so easy to sympathize with me. What if I were the drunk person? What if it was my fault? In a kind of strange way, it was a convenient big experience because it was not difficult to confuse or misunderstand. But having said that, it was still awful.
Yeah, and you write with a fair bit of vulnerability and precision about it was 5 years after the tragedy that you were in a season of what would you call it, Jerry? Overwhelm, upheaval, immense anguish? What words would you put to that season, Jerry?
Two words come to mind: vertigo is one. I always felt like I was somehow stumbling,
Mhm.
that as if I were in one of those rooms with all the weird mirrors, and you just can't get your feet on the ground. Disorientation would also come to mind. I mean, obviously, there was a lot of emotional pain, but it was more than that. It wasn't just that. I felt like I had moved into a new house. It was pitch black at night. And when I come out of my bedroom door, all the furniture has been rearranged and I can't make my way through it. I keep bumping into things, I keep falling over. The world felt unsafe to me
Mhm.
and profoundly confusing. Actually, one of the biggest emotions I experienced and still do to this day is bewilderment. More than anger, or that, it's bewilderment. The world is a constant question mark to me now. How can this happen? But it's not just to me; it's to so many people. I mean, just last night, my wife Patricia and I had a long conversation about why some people just seem to get punished all the time by life. Why are they the ones who just get sick all the time, or seem to have one bad thing happen to them after another? My experience was pretty clear and crisp and clean, but I know people where it's unrelenting. It's not just one big pain, it's one pain after another, and they don't often receive a kind of public validation for it or recognition. It's a quiet pain, it's a pain that's hard to explain. There are all kinds of pains that have a kind of debilitating quality because they're secret or less observable, or just not as clean as mine. And I grieve over those all the time now.
And I wanna hold your word bewilderment because as we get into your book, and really what I wanna focus on, Jerry, is the new chapters to your book that you've added. There's a chapter at the end called "Looking Back, Looking Ahead," and you're reflecting on the past 30 years of your life since tragedy struck. And you begin by naming the paradox that you live with every day, the paradox of goodness in the world and sorrow, suffering, agony, anguish in the world. And you tell a little anecdote about, you're making coffee one morning, you go out to get the paper, and you notice the beauty of the planet Venus early in the morning, and you're struck by its beauty. But then you go on to share that later that morning, a few hours later, you're going to receive a phone call from your sister who will tell you that your grandnephew has been diagnosed with bone cancer. And this is what you write in that section. You say, "Every day I live in this tension. Venus in the early morning sky and the diagnosis of cancer in a young man, beauty and pain, glory and agony, transcendence and terror, hope and sorrow. It fills me with wonder confusion and fear, I can hardly make sense of it. I love those words, and I think of them next to that word bewilderment. There's something agonizing and, as you say, scary about reality because it includes immense beauty. We know this, it does, and it includes immense pain. And this is particularly true for people who have experienced trauma. So, will you share a little, Jerry, about how have you navigated this paradox and this tension of goodness and pain in your life?
Well, I think it begins with a very clear recognition that this is simply reality, that there's something glorious about reality. And all of us know this, Adam. I mean, we catch glimpses of something that is so beautiful, whether it's a sunset or a sunrise. And I know I'm sounding kind of pathetically romantic here, but it's true. What something makes us stop. We're taking a walk in the fall and the leaves are changing and we have a perfect angle of sunlight coming at us. And the world comes alive with color and we just stop and we gaze for a minute. Or we hold a grandchild. There are so many examples of this that we could cite. Now, not all of us are attuned to it. And I'll come back to that. That's one of the tragedies of life is that we're so washed over with pain. We lose our capacity to see beauty at the same time. But that's simply a part of life, is all of those moments, those brief glimpses into the glory of the world, which I believe God has given to us. All of them are like signposts, and they point them beyond themselves to a greater beauty, to beauty with a capital B, or truth with a capital T. On the other hand, the world is just full of pain. In fact, every morning I sigh, and in my prayers I say, God, there's so much groaning and bleeding in the world. There's that groaning and bleeding that I see and experience just in my own community of friends. A wayward child, a diagnosis of cancer, all of which happens now almost every week because I'm 71 years old and my circle is large. Or you read about it or you hear about it through the grapevine. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, do I have the courage and maybe just the common sense? I'm not quite sure what word to use there, to recognize that I'm called to step into this, not to avoid it, not to get around it, but to step into it, to learn to carry the pain and become attuned to the beauty, and therefore to enlarge my capacity as a creature who's been made in the image of God. And that capacity not only has to do with my experience of relationships in the world, but also my capacity to know God and to experience God in some way. And I don't mean experience God just intellectually, I mean experience God emotionally and physically, and then to learn to empathize with others, to rejoice in their successes and to mourn their losses. And I have that in me, Adam. Every human being does. I have that. It's often dormant, it's undeveloped, it's neglected, but I have that capacity. And God calls that forth in me. He calls it forth in me when I have that moment of beauty. And He says, Jerry, stop, pay attention. But I also, God invites me into it when I experience pain too, or I see pain in other people. And instead of turning away and avoiding, I step toward. I remember the memory just came back to me right now. I had a man at our church come approach me maybe 3 years after the accident, and he said, "I know I've not talked to you, Jerry, and I'm really sorry, but you're my worst nightmare. Everything that happened to you, I dread in every cell in my body, and I just couldn't stand being around you for that reason." Now, contrast that with a small group of my friends at the university who literally surrounded me the week after the accident. And we've been meeting together mostly every week for the last 30 years. 30 years. Now, obviously, my experience quickly receded in the background. Pretty soon it was a diagnosis of cancer, actually two of them. And then one of my best friends lost his wife 5 years ago. He was close to me when I lost mine. I was close to him when he lost his. He was in my second wedding 20 years after the accident, and I just did his a little over a year ago. In other words, we did life together. But that meant we had to step into each other's pain, even though that pain was our quote worst nightmare.
There's a paragraph about training your eyes to see beauty and to absorb beauty. And I just want to read it, Jerry, and then get your reflection on it. You write, I'm learning to live in the tension paradox. You're talking about that tension of the goodness and the heartache of the world. Beauty is all around me. And here's the sentence that really struck me. I am training my eyes to see it and my soul to absorb it. My kids are adults now, all married and with children. I see them often and I enjoy our shared life together. I remarried 10 years ago. I treasure Patricia, the woman I married. She is pure gift to me. There is beauty in this world. It is everywhere, but suffering is all around me too. Now, there's a lot in that paragraph, but the part I really want to focus on is this notion of training your eyes to see beauty and training your soul to absorb that beauty. This is an important task, confession, invitation, especially for people with a history of trauma. Because for those of us with trauma, beauty and goodness can be terrifying. And so we have to train our eyes to see it and we have to train our souls to absorb it. How do you, Jerry, how have you done that? How have you trained your eyes to see beauty and goodness, past and present? And why is it necessary, do you think, to train ourselves to see goodness in this world?
Well, I actually want to begin with a more abstract question. To ask the question, what am I? What are you? What am I really as a human being? Am I just a creature of instinct? Am I purely a product of my environment? So it's life is like the luck of the draw. Whether you're born into poverty or you're born into a dysfunctional home, or you're born into the middle class with wonderful parents, whether you're born with a lot of talent or no talent at all, is that what humanity is? We're just sort of the products of our environment. Are we purely physical beings, or are we image bearers made in the image of God? I mean, that really is the question we have to ask and answer. Are we in some mysterious way a reflection of the Almighty God, like no other creature can? And if so, how do I step into that? How do I grow into that reality? How can I become what I am by the grace of God? I mean, that's a paradoxical thing to say. How can I become who I already am? How
Mhm.
can I discover what's already in me by God's creation and by God's redemption? And in my mind, there are two answers to that. One is I have to live a life that's imbued by grace. This is not something that can be achieved by mere effort alone. It's beyond me. And so the first thing I have to do is step into the grace of God, God's infinite love, and not just love, not a grudging love, but infinite delight in me, even in my fallenness. I've rediscovered the power of delight as a grandparent. I'm going to get teary here. I just fiercely love my grandchildren. I see them a lot. I mean, yesterday, Charlie and Henry were over for the whole day. I have them every Tuesday, a 5-year old and a 2-year old. Roman came for a while in the morning. He's my 3-year old. In fact, he just left today, too. And then Landon was with us for a couple of hours in the afternoon. 4 boys, ages 4, 3, 2, and 1. I was so overwhelmed with the goodness and the wonder of being in that place. Now these kids can be brats, and even their brattiness entertains me. And I think once in a while, and that's how God feels about me, that he delights in me in even in my fallenness. So the first thing is grace. And the other thing is growth. It's a matter of making decisions to keep growing as a human being. Those are afforded to us simply through the circumstances of life. My wife, Patricia, and I do a lot of pre-marriage counseling, and we will say with a smile, wry smile on our lips, you know, marriage is a sanctifying institution, and you're going to be marrying a mirror, and you're going to be looking at yourself virtually every day, and not everything you see is going to be pretty. Marriage is one of the most glorious and ruthless institutions on the planet because we can't escape ourselves. So part of it is just the circumstances of life. But the other part is training. In there, it's a matter of making little decisions every day, little decisions. Every time I'm taking a walk and my grandchild does something, to stop, pause, and stare or gaze, a little decision. It's in the little things. It's the little things every day, and that's what I mean by training.
Yes. And there's something courageous and honest about, even though we have pain in our lives, being willing to look and pause and ponder when beauty presents itself in a moment in our day. That's an act of courage, and it's a necessary desire to grow that, if we're going to become more and more the image bearers that we are. Because God takes in both the fullness of the delight of creation and the groaning and the agony of the horror of what's happening on planet Earth, both. And you're inviting us in this book to have an enlarged heart by training ourselves to take in fully both the goodness and the pain. Later in this chapter, you're saying that sometimes people, you're just recounting that sometimes people will ask you, how your experience has changed over the years. They'll ask you, have you recovered, Jerry, from the devastation? They'll ask if your life is easier now that years have passed, that time has passed. And here's your response. I love your response. You say, no, I have not recovered, but I carry the loss more lightly. No, my life is not easier or harder. It is both. Ah, what do you mean when you say that your pain is not easier or harder, but both?
Well, it's so ironic that we have the interview scheduled for today, December 16. I would be celebrating my 50th wedding anniversary if I were still married to Linda. And I'm sad today, and rightly so. I mean, I never got a chance to live that story out. What would it be like now after 50 years? Who would I be? Who would Linda be? What kind of marriage would we have? We were a motion picture that suddenly stopped before the picture was supposed to be ended. It was maybe 45 minutes in, and we thought it was going to be at a 2.5 hour film. Can you really get on the other side of that? I'm not sure it's possible. I'm not sure we should. This is an occasion for a lifetime of mourning. Our problem, Adam, I think, is that we think more sequentially rather than paradoxically. So we think there's pain and then there's happiness. We're sad and then we're happy. We experience pain and then we somehow recovery. So it's this, then that, hard, then easy. But I tend to think more in terms of tension or paradox, where it becomes both harder and easier all the time. I use this analogy. Let's say I'm walking through the National Gallery of Art in London, and I'm looking at all these beautiful paintings on the wall. And I see them and I study them, and they're beautiful to me. But next to me is an artist who spent her whole lifetime developing a capacity to be a great artist. Now, we're looking at the same painting, aren't we? But we're not looking at the same painting because that person's capacity is so much greater just because they've given themselves to that artistic medium for so long. Think about all the failures that they painted. Think about all the things they learned through mistakes. It wasn't an easy and it wasn't a natural process. And so, in all of that failure and in all of that experience of beauty, they look at the same painting as I do and they see with a different set of eyes. I think that's what happens as we mature as human beings is that the sadness grows deeper and so does the joy. Instead of moving from a giddy happiness, we move to a deeper level of joy. I think that's what happens over time, depending on the kinds of choices we make and the grace we continue to live in. So, harder and easier.
Let me read another short paragraph from this chapter, which I think this paragraph is particularly true for Christians. And here's what you write. This is about muscling our way through pain. You say, we attempt to live heroically and turn suffering into an inspiring testimony before the suffering has even sunk in. We look for the good that might come from loss before we name and condemn the evil that it was and is. We try to muscle our way through and move on by sheer force of will. But, you write, it is all in vain. Severe loss is unrelenting. It always gets its way. This is not a pessimistic book that you wrote. It's not at all. But you're putting language to something here when you say that severe loss always gets its way. And I would say that that is true for trauma as well. There's something about abuse, trauma, catastrophic loss that we respond to it often initially by trying to muscle our way through the pain in our bodies. How did you do that, Jerry? How did you try and muscle your way through it in those early years?
Well, I'm a pretty high functioning person. It's just kind of how I'm hardwired. So I'm high functioning. I also had children to take care of. I mean, I immediately inherited an 8-year old and a 6-year old and a 2-year old who were injured and profoundly traumatized. And I also had to make a living. So I had some circumstances that kind of pushed me to keep going, to muscle my way through life when it was really difficult. I hardly had the luxury of collapse. So part of that is related to my background and my circumstances. But I did crash on literally the first anniversary of the accident, September 27. I woke up and I couldn't get out of bed. I did get out of bed, but I couldn't get out of bed. I mean, if that makes any sense. I mean, I was so profoundly depressed, and I simply stepped into a world of darkness. Now, what's so strange about that at all is I could still see everything. And yet it was as if I was looking at the world through a scrim that was gray. And I stayed in that place for a long time. And it reminded me that a great testimony, positive outcomes, Christian character, all that simply will not spare you from having to turn and face that pain for what it is. It's like a wild animal that keeps stalking you and chasing you until it finally catches up to you. Oh, this actually leads to a story. I know a lovely couple, and they are lovely. They are wonderful people, parents, everything. And they lost a child in a tragic accident. And Patricia and I ran into them maybe a week later at a restaurant. Big smiles on their face. Boy, the Lord's really using this as an evangelistic tool, and lots of people are becoming Christians through this. And they just were turning this into a testimony. But when they walked away, I said to Pat, they're going to crash. And we saw them a year later, and their faces looked like they had just come out of hell. I mean, they were so depressed and exhausted. You could see it on their faces that the depth of sorrow was overwhelming. And the conversation we had with them that time was very different. Now, I'm not saying that these tragedies do not become testimonies of the grace and goodness of God. I mean, certainly that's the case with me, but that it cannot be at the expense of the pain we simply have to turn and face.
You confess in your chapter, Jerry, that in the years following the accident, you in your imagination, you'd imagine living kind of two stories. The story that was actually yours, which was shaped by the profound absence of your mother, your wife, your daughter, and then another story, the story in your imagination, which included them still being alive. In other words, it sounds like it was hard for you to live the life that was actually yours in those early years. And as you continue writing, you say, I wasn't avoiding the reality of the devastation. And you weren't resigned to living a permanently shattered life either. And then you write just a very short sentence that I think is so profound. You wrote this: it is simply another story. The temptation, I think, Jerry, for many of us who have experienced heartache, trauma, loss, is to hate the story that is ours, at least part of it. Can you say more about how you've come to realize that your life has turned out to be another story than you had envisioned? Just share. I want to hear more about that sentence. It is simply another story.
I spent several years fantasizing changing the sequence of that particular day. I bet I went back to the scene of that accident 1,000 times and did one little thing to change it: sneeze at a stop sign, having to take a bathroom break, anything that would have changed the day as it turned out. In effect, what I was doing was, I don't want my reality to be what it is now. I reject it. And so I kept fantasizing the power I had at my disposal, but only in my imagination to change it. The problem is that I couldn't and can't. And so eventually you have to turn at your and take a look at your life as it is, however painful and awful it is, and say, what can I make of this life? And that's a really hard decision to make because it's not a life that you want, at least not at first. But ironically, it's choosing that life that actually leads to the fact that you finally want it. And not because you get a second wife or you adopt a child. You don't necessarily fix things. I mean, eventually you simply have to make a choice. In the wake of devastation, I choose life, whatever it happens to be. Instead of fantasizing the ideal world you lost or the world you wish you could repair, you have to let that go and carry it with you as a memory, in which case it will inform and shape how you live in the reality that you have right now. Now, a memory comes to mind. We were in the emergency vehicle after the accident for about an hour. It's a long drive to Coeur d'Alene. All four of us were together. My young son John had broken his femur, and there were injuries, but they were quiet. I comforted them, rubbed their heads, and this kind of thing. The emergency people in the back of the vehicle said nothing wisely, and so I had an hour of relative silence. And strange as this might say, Adam, that hour was the most rational hour I've had in my entire life. When I got out of the emergency vehicle, I collapsed and just couldn't stop crying. The trauma hit me only then. In that hour, it was like I was between realities. And I saw life with such profound clarity. I realized that I had lost three members of my family, three generations, and I had no power to change that. I also looked at those three little people in that emergency vehicle and realized they would take most of their cues from me. And I looked up at God with a ferocity that I think probably even made God a little nervous. And I said, the bleeding is going to stop right here, right now with me. I'm not going to let this thing set off a chain reaction that's going to lead to generations of pain. I want the bleeding to stop now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. I could not stand to see my children suffer more than they already had. Now, obviously, easier said than done, to say the least, but I knew what I was up again, and that motivation really pushed me into choosing life because I did not want my kids to experience generations of destruction. That was no small task.
There's the truth of that moment, and then there is what you write about over the next, the first 5 years after the accident. And here's what you write. You say, "For a long time, I was too tired to believe much of anything. I remember attending worship, unable to sing or pray or listen. I remember sitting in silence night after night, incapable of thinking a rational thought about God. I remember crying every day." The way you write about it, it was like your nightly ritual. You'd tuck your young kids into bed, and then you would go into a different kind of place where all of these things that I just read were true for you. And I'm struck, Jerry, by the parallels between childhood abuse and catastrophic loss of loved ones. I mean, there are differences to be sure, but what you're describing is often experienced by people with a history of abuse. The struggle to believe things that we used to believe, the exhaustion to go on living. So when you were in that 5-year period, Jerry, how did you feel about all that your body was going through? All the bewilderment, all the exhaustion, the inability to sing or pray or even believe some of what you had previously believed. What was all that like for you, Jerry? How'd you navigate it?
Well, that's a large question, Adam. I mean, I first had to recognize that the pain was complete. It's not just pain in mind, not just pain in emotions, but even pain in body. I didn't sleep for a long, long time. That's one example. I had a kind of nervous agitation. Even my eyesight changed, and this is going to be peculiar to say because my eyesight was the same, but everything seemed farther away. I'd be looking and talking to a person that was standing 5 feet away from me, and they honestly seemed to be 100 miles away. So I just stepped into such a different world where hearing, eyesight, body, mind, emotions had been altered and played a huge role. And that was with me all the time. What I mean by ritualized loss is I tried, not always successfully to say the least, to create spaces where I could really pay attention to it. Loss is unrelenting. It never goes away. But I think there are periods where we can turn and face it. We can be quieter. We can stare into the black hole and recognize that that black hole is just part of life and it's not going to go away. I would go into my living room after my kids were in bed and I would sit in silence. And I would sit there for a long time, not 10 minutes, not 15 minutes. I would just sit in silence and I would allow myself to feel the pain. I'd sometimes lay flat on my face on the floor. I listened to a lot of music, especially I'm in a classical music guy, so I listen to a lot of great choral music, like Fauré's Requiem, for example. And that music became the music of my soul. It's interesting that Patricia, I still listen to that music, and I'm still moved to tears a lot. And she said, "This is one part of you, Jerry, I can't get to. It's like it eludes me. It transcends me. I don't understand why you have such a deep connection to this music." Well, it's because the circumstances under which I listen to it were so profound for me. I would occasionally recite a psalm that I had memorized. There were just a few of them that spoke absolutely to the depths of my being. Um, Whither shall I go from thy spirit, and whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there thy hand shall lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, let only darkness cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to thee. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light to thee. Now, that didn't do anything for me. It didn't solve the problem. It didn't bring my wife back to me. But for some reason, that language just pierced me at the depths of my soul and ended up being very powerful for me. I had a dream that I tell in the book, months after the accident. And in the dream, I was chasing after a sun that was setting, and I was running frantically with a sense of panic and foreboding. And no matter how fast I ran, I realized that the sun was going to beat me to the horizon, and eventually it did and disappeared. And I stopped, exhausted, breathing heavily, and realized that the light was going to abandon me. And then I turned and, with a sense of utter terror, saw the darkness sweeping over me. And then I woke up. And honestly, Adam, I believed in that moment that I would live in darkness for the rest of my life. There was an existential terror that I'm not sure the greatest poet in the world could get to. And I talked to my sister about this a few days later, and she said, Jerry, this might be a cue to you, because as long as you're going west, you're actually going to stay in the darkness longer. It's like flying in an airplane where you take off at 9 at night and you go west. When you arrive, even 8 hours later, you're still in darkness. But if you have the courage to go east and plunge into the darkness, all the sooner will you come to the sunrise. Now, you don't come to just one sunrise. You keep plunging into darkness and coming to other sunrises. But it takes courage to turn and face it head on. And you can't do it alone, ever. You need a small group, you need a mentor, you need a few close friends who are going to stay there. If you don't have them, find them, a pastor or a therapist who can be your companion, your long term partner as you take on these darknesses in your life, not just the loss, but other losses that you had that are triggered by this loss or whatever. And you plunge into that darkness, you will come to the sunrise. Many of them, I think.
And this reminds me, there's a very practical section in this chapter, Jerry, where you attempt to answer a question that's so relevant for people with trauma. And here's the question that you pose: how is it possible to keep going when facing acute stress and anguish, sadness and anger, exhaustion and doubt, regret and longing? Let me read the question that you pose again. How is it possible to keep going when you're facing acute stress and anguish, sadness and anger, exhaustion and doubt, regret and longing? And you offer some concrete steps that people can take, and I want to just look at a couple of them. You've already alluded to them. The first one that you write is face the experience directly, which is what I think of you getting at when you say head east. What do you mean by face the experience directly? And what's the alternative to that, Jerry?
Well, trying to run away and avoid. I mean, that is one of the classic ways that we respond to pain. And there are some classic ways you're familiar with. Most of our listeners will be avoidant behaviors, avoidant patterns. If you lose a spouse, remarrying too soon, becoming busy, addictive behaviors, some that are immediately and obviously destructive. Some are more subtle, overwork, for example, or turning it into a testimony prematurely, which I mentioned before. Those are avoidant behaviors too. But again, in the long run, it's just going to run us down. And so, with the help of the believing community, friends, therapist, pastor, mentor, and so on, we've got to dare pivot and turn and look hard. And not just at the kind of original experience, whether it's the abuse, but also at lots of other things that it's going to expose. So let me give you an example of that. My loss was really obvious, a wife, a daughter, and a mother, but I also lost the ongoing relationship. And that's a different thing. It wasn't just the person I lost, it was the relationship I lost, and that relationship had a dynamic quality to it. So a motion picture came to an end and turned into a snapshot, and I had to look at the relationship as it was when it stopped. And Adam, not everything I saw was pretty. I saw myself. I saw the fact that in some ways I was a good husband, in other ways I was not a good husband. I had to make peace with that and recognized I have a story to live out in the wake of these discoveries. The kind of parent I was, the kind of son I was to my mother, the kind of husband I was, the kind of wife my first wife was. All of that was a story that simply stopped and never moved to completion. There's just something profoundly sad about that because we always live as if life has a kind of dynamic quality to it. We go to bed at night thinking, well, I have another chance tomorrow. Well, I went to bed that night and there was no chance tomorrow, at
Mhm.
least not in that relationship. And eventually you have to say, Lord, I ask for your forgiveness. I pray that you'll give me the grace to be able to live out this story, but not with those people anymore, but other people. I still had the chance to be a father of those 3 living children, and I gave my energy to that, and now these last 11 years, I've been able to be a husband again, and everything that I learned and experienced in that first marriage, and then the 20 years in between, I was able to carry into the second marriage. So, I mean, it's a matter of making these redemptive choices, not to let the story come to an end, even if that particular story came to an end. There's still a life to be lived. There's still good to be done. There's still beauty to be experienced, but you have to make a choice to step into it. And that means you've got to look at the darkness that's there and the losses that exist of whatever kind they happen to be. That has to be
Mhm.
and is a necessary part of the journey. As I said, I wanted to turn over every stone. That's really the only choice I had, or continue to hide and mourn, but with no kind of redemptive outlet. And that seemed to me even a worse loss. In fact, in the book, I call it the second loss and the greater loss. The first loss is the loss involved with the circumstances, the observable loss. But the second loss I call is the death of the soul, where anger turns to revenge and sorrow to self pity, and we become bitter, we become smaller, we shrivel up as human beings instead of turning ourselves and opening ourselves up to the world and all that can still happen, all the possibilities that are still there.
One of the things that I think keeps sorrow from turning to self-pity or resentment is another one of the concrete steps that you offer people, and it's the way you put it is grieve previous losses. Previous losses. Now, boy, is this important, especially for people with trauma. I want to read the paragraph that you wrote about this and then just get your reflections on it. You say that mental health professionals suggest that loss often becomes a triggering event. It awakens memories of previous losses, failure, abandonment, abuse, neglect, despair, rejection. It forces a revisitation of the past. We thought we had made peace and moved on. We are surprised by the strength of our feelings: anger, terror, shame, and helplessness. Loss invites us to return to those experiences. Now, that's a good paragraph for people that are engaging their trauma. Can you share more about it, Jerry? Adversity in our present day life, whether it's something catastrophic like what you endured, or it is the heartache and the ambivalence and the powerlessness that someone is experiencing, the anxiety as they start to engage some of their trauma from their family of origin, whatever it is, adversity in the present, you're suggesting invites us to return to the past. And you're saying it is necessary to grieve those previous losses. Say more about that.
Well, the operative term in that sentence is when I say we thought we had made peace and moved on. You don't move on. You carry everything from the past with you. The question really is how you carry it. You don't get over it. You don't overcome it. You don't move beyond it. The challenge is how we learn to carry the past. Will it be debilitating? Will it be hidden and secret? Will it be out in the open? Will we develop stronger legs and stronger back to carry it in a way that's more redemptive for ourselves and helpful to other people? That's really the choice we have to make, is learning how to carry it. Now, again, in my case, there was one loss that was obvious. There were other losses that were not so obvious. I mean, the same was true with my kids, by the way. They lost their mother. That's the obvious one. It took a while for us to figure out they also lost what I call the us. They lost the relationship between mom and dad. That's a different thing. The conversations, the fights, the making up, the humor, the affection, all the things that make for a reasonably healthy marriage relationship, they lost all of that too. And so there are losses that are less obvious, and many of those lie buried in the past. Losses that might go back even to kind of what you call a pre memory stage, that are stored in our bodies, or losses that occurred in junior high or high school, or losses associated with a parent neglect or abuse or severe rejection in high school. I was just having a conversation with somebody yesterday who said to me, I have so many friends right now, too many friends. I'm drowning in friendship. And one reason why is because I have a deep memory in me, a body memory in me, I'll say, of being in early high school and not having any friends at all. Now, that's a memory, and we all of us have those of one kind
Mhm.
or another. And when we experience a loss, those often get awakened. It's like a volcano that explodes, that's been
Mhm.
lying dormant for even centuries. And all of a sudden, you look and you say, where did that come from? Sometimes we literally remember things that we hadn't remembered for years. The presenting loss gives us an opportunity to revisit those others and to find a deeper level of healing. Now, I don't mean indulge. The twin errors are avoid on the one hand and indulge on the other. I am a victim. You are a victim. All of us are victims. All of us are perpetrators. And all of us have a chance to set a course for our lives. And avoidance and indulgence are two bad alternatives. The proper one is to learn how to carry the past with us differently, more redemptively, so that we can be fully awake and attuned to the story that we can live out right now.
And for you, it was years of mourning both your loss of your mother, wife, daughter, but also those previous losses that got stirred up.
Yeah, that's right.
But you faced that heartache, you mourned, you listened to those classical music pieces, you wept, you let your body metabolize your pain, and eventually you began carrying it differently.
Yeah, never ideally. I'm hardly a model here. I want to duck that responsibility entirely. I did some things well, I did some things not so well. I'm not an ideal, but I have reflected on this a ton.
But I think it's helpful that you're saying, "Hey, I'm not an ideal," because in that, implicit in that, you seem to be confessing that there were times when you did avoid and there were times when you did indulge.
Very much so. I went through a pretty significant period where I would binge watch TV. Yeah, it was an uneven journey, to say the least.
Yes.
But what happened over time is that the world simply got bigger to me. It became a larger place to live in. By larger, I mean far bigger than me, my own pain, my own experience. Larger in its beauty and larger in its suffering. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn," and he didn't put it in the past tense. He didn't say, "Blessed are those who once mourned but are now feeling good." Mourning should be a lifestyle for us, Adam, because there's a lot in life to mourn. And somehow we can learn to mourn with joy. That's the tension. That's the paradox. That's how Jesus lived, is this kind of smile on his face of joy, not so much laughter, but smile. He
Mhm.
had this confidence that all would be well because God exists and God loves and God is good and God is taking care of the business of redemption. And at the same time, he would stand at the tomb of Lazarus and openly weep. And I think that's what it means as we grow, our capacity as image bearers grows through the work of Christ in our lives. Then our capacity to step into and experience this bigger world grows too.
Hmm.
And that means we empathize with people, we take pain into our lives, and it means that we see life as profoundly holy and profoundly beautiful.
Jerry, I am so grateful for your words, your time, your presence today. Thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing about your journey.
My privilege, Adam. You're a great conversation partner. I feel like I'm in the presence of a good soul here. Thanks.